Welcome to Detroit Auto Accident Law with Ravid and Associates.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Detroit Auto Accident Law with the trial lawyers of Ravid and Associates. Ravid and Associates is a Michigan-based personal injury firm that's fought for more than 10,000 accident victims statewide. My guest today is Mark D. Foreman, an attorney at Ravid and Associates who focuses on personal injury, wrongful death, and motor vehicle accident cases. He's got decades of experience handling serious, high-stakes litigation. My name's Sean O'Connor, and today, Mark and I are talking about wrongful death after a Michigan car accident and what families need to know. Mark, good to see you.
Good to see you, Sean.
Not the most happy topic, but these things happen. That's why we're here. From a legal perspective, what turns a car accident into a wrongful death case in Michigan?
Well, not to sound condescending, but the death of the plaintiff, okay? Somebody dies, okay? That's what turns a normal car accident case into a wrongful death case, if somebody has died and somebody else is at fault for that death, okay? Mm-hmm. So once you determine that somebody has died in the case and somebody else is at fault, then you get to the next step of the case, which was how do you proceed legally? So if somebody calls me and says, oh, my loved one has died in a car accident or something to that effect, then the first thing I'm going to want to do is meet with the family, okay? Whoever the major components of that family are, mother, father, grandparent, whoever, okay? And then what I have to explain to them is that if a person is either deceased or incompetent, they cannot represent themselves in court. So you need to do what is known as open up a probate estate, okay? A probate court in the state of Michigan has its own judges, its own wing of the circuit court building, and according to their rules, by opening up an estate, you file a petition for conservatorship saying that so-and-so has died. I am being nominated as the conservator to represent the estate of that person. And then there will be a hearing before a judge where he will sign off and give you the right to represent the estate of that person. Okay? In a typical case, let's say a spouse dies in a car accident, the conservator would be the living spouse. Let's say a child dies, usually there might be two conservators. The husband and wife might be co-conservators. But either way, they now have the legal authority to stand in the shoes of the deceased person and open up a probate estate. So once the judge approves the appointment of a conservator, now you have a name by which you can file a lawsuit. And that lawsuit will now be, estate of William Smith by conservator Joanne and William Smith, okay? Now you have a legal entity to open up a probate estate, and then you can file a complaint in the name of that estate. So those are the early steps of a wrongful death case, making sure that you have an estate opened and that you have the necessary parties to file your lawsuit with. I would do right away, get the estate opened, but I may not file the lawsuit right away because it's a possibility that that case is open and shut. Maybe there's $1 million of coverage, and there's absolutely no disputing that the defendant was at fault, and they'd be willing to pay the full policy limit without going to a full lawsuit. So you may not file the lawsuit right away and spend all the extra money that you have to do to get there if you can get there without it. But you do have to open up the probate estate immediately. That is step one that has to be done right away. So that makes it different from a regular, say, personal injury action from a car accident.
Yeah. Non-fatal. You mentioned, the appointment of conservators, whether it's a, surviving spouse or parents, something like that. Are there limitations? I mean, who exactly is able to bring a wrongful death claim? How's that typically handled within a family or are there certain people who are allowed to bring the wrongful death claim?
Well, once again, when you go before a probate court judge, they're very well schooled in this topic. And let's say that typically, I don't do my own probate work unless it's a very, very simplistic probate matter. We'll hire a probate law firm that specializes in it, okay? And I have one that I've used my entire career. They're excellent. And so they'll bring the paperwork to go before a probate court judge, nominating a person to be the conservator of the estate for that person, okay? Now, part of the paperwork that gets filed in that is all kinds of affidavits saying who are the living relatives of the deceased. Who are the parents? Who are the brothers and sisters? Because those are the only ones that have privy in the state of Michigan under probate succession law. So you'll bring a petition before the judge, and hopefully you've talked to the family and they're all in agreement. They're not fighting with one another. And they'll agree upon who they want to stand in their shoes as the conservator. But what I explained to them is, just because you guys agree as to who the conservator will be doesn't mean they get more, okay? It just means they are the one who speaks on behalf of the estate. So you don't have to worry about distrusting them or overseeing them. You know, you can hire your own attorney if you want, but you should be of a similar mind that when you go before the probate court judge and he looks at all the paperwork and he sees all the affidavits and that the living parent is the one who's being nominated to be the conservator, the judge is going to stamp it and say, fine with me, and put his name on the order. Now you have an official appointment of a conservator for the estate, and you have somebody under which you can start to negotiate a settlement or to bring a lawsuit.
I see. What about, let's talk damages for a minute. What categories of damages can be pursued in a wrongful death case, and how are those typically evaluated?
You know, those are about as many different colors as the rainbow has in it. If a person is a breadwinner, let's say a father, and he's the main breadwinner or the only breadwinner of a family, and he's got a wife and 3 kids, and he's in his middle 20s, and he's in a profession that, you know, we can bring in an economist who can project what his income would be over the remainder of his working years and project that out into the future. And they have all kinds of fancy actuarial tables that they use to determine that, but they're a professional and they can give a report that the court will respect. So that's one way of what they call blackboarding, the value of a death and what it should or could be worth. A lot of times you're limited by policy coverage, like in an individual car accident. Maybe the other driver has $100,000 of coverage, or $250,000, $250,000, or $500,000, or whatever. So those are usually your limits right there, because very seldomly do you want to take the time, or will you take the time to go after a person individually? Okay. Now, if a billionaire carries a $20,000 policy, I'm going to go after him individually. Okay, because what he did was wrong by only taking $20,000 of coverage when he had the ability to do much more. But in most cases, people have far more coverage than what they are worth personally, and we don't go after them personally. If it's a corporate policy, like a truck driver, or in the case I had earlier in my career, a street sweeper, where the limits are very, very high, then you're back with your proofs. You know, what are the injuries? What are the nature of them? If it's wrongful death, that's one thing. If it's life debilitating, if it means they can't be a breadwinner, you can blackboard their earning potential. There's the emotional side of the case. A person who loses a limb or suffers horrendous disfiguration, you know, those can be argued as well. And in that case, it's more verbal and oral argument than it is scientific proofs. You can bring up like cases of what cases like that have tried and verdicts have rendered for in the past, and use those as argument in dealing with the other side. So, and that part's really more wide open. You know, I would say there are no rules when it comes to that side of the equation. There are the obvious ones, blackboarding their future income potential. But then there are the other ones, the emotional ones, you know, the loss of a limb, the loss of lifestyle, the, you know, what they call, loss of marital privileges, things of that nature. Those are things that are proven with much different level of proofs. So all those things add up together to make the value of a case, including, obviously, if they're injured, the objective test results proving their injuries. All of those things go into making up the value of a case. Not one, but all of them.
What tends to matter most when it comes to proving responsibility in a fatal accident?
Well, I would say in a car accident, your very first piece of evidence is always the police report, okay? The police report gets rid of liability topics in probably 80% of all accidents, okay? Because it's usually somebody ran a red light, or somebody hit somebody from behind, or somebody ran a yield sign, or, you know, so usually the liability is pretty clear. Once in a blue moon, the other side will argue, well, hey, the police report's wrong. You know, we say it's wrong. In which case, maybe you have to investigate a little further. You have to look for cameras in the community, in the intersection, nearby business. Or you examine the damage records that each insurance company does when they evaluate the damage done to a vehicle. The pictures, because those can be very clear as to where the damage was done. If you see a T-bone and one guy's front is damaged and the other guy's driver's side is damaged, you realize you have a T-bone. So the only thing you have to realize at that point is who had the right-of-way, okay? And sometimes there's witnesses to an accident. So there's all the various things you can go to, but I would say 80% or more of the time the police report settles that topic.
Interesting. Got it. We were talking about insurance companies earlier. How do insurance companies tend to approach wrongful death cases? And, what changes in how they evaluate or defend wrongful death claims?
That's a very open-ended question. Like, I can
Yeah.
say confidentially that I'm very happy to see certain insurance companies on the other side of a case, and I'm rather unhappy to see other ones. I'm not going to
Oh,
name them,
interesting. Yeah.
but
Sure.
there are some insurance companies that are just a pleasure to deal with. They're professional, they're
Hmm.
reasonable, and I know when I see them on a case that it's going to be a happy ending because I know what my case is, and I know that they're not going to do any tricks or delay or deny or defend for no good reason. Other insurance companies, as soon as I see their name on the case, I knew I'm in for a long haul, and I better cross
Mm.
every T, dot every I, and go overboard on my proofs because they're not going to stop. They're not going to they're going to shortchange my case at every turn, so I'm just going to proceed as though they're not even there and build my case as strong as I possibly can. And when I do come to the table, I want to, it's be like an all-night poker game. I want a big fat stack of chips, and I want their stack to be very little. And then I'm just going to lean on them for the rest of the way. Okay, so that's the way I would view that. Okay, so and then funny thing is that some insurance companies have really wonderful adjusters to deal with, while others of them are the worst possible human beings imaginable. Okay, and you run into both. So you could run into a nice insurance company with a really mean-spirited adjuster, or vice versa. By being around as long as I have, I almost never run into an adjuster or an insurance company that I haven't dealt with before and have a feeling for what I'm up against when I do it. Okay?
Yeah, yeah. No, it's interesting. Like there's the written law, but then there's just the humans you're dealing with in these cases that are, as you said before about jury trials, people are unpredictable.
Claims adjusters are very specific animals. Some of them are brand new and real green around the gills. Others of them have been around forever, and they're jaded and cynical. And I make it a point of being very professional and very civil and very collegial with everybody I deal with. I don't come on like a bull with its horn sticking out. I come on very professional, offering them whatever information they want from my file as quickly as they would like to see it. And I presume that I'm going to be nice until it's time to not be nice. Okay. So I prefer to go in there and be very civil and very nice and very professional all the way through a case as long as I can possibly do that, unless they make me be otherwise, in which case I can do that. I don't like doing it, but I can do it. So
Right. Well, yeah, you got to fight for your clients. Let's talk about, the families that are involved in these cases. What challenges do they often run into once these cases start moving forward that, they may not be expecting at the beginning? Like what surprises family?
once again, families are impossible to predict until you get into them a little bit. Sometimes you have families that don't get along or didn't get along in the past, and now somebody dies, and now they're all at each other's throat, thinking there's going to be a payday and I want my share and all of that. So in that situation, about the best thing that I can offer them is to try and get a meeting with all of them, if possible. I'll come to their home, sit in their living room, meet them at their church, wherever, meet them in a coffee shop, and explain to them that, listen, this is not an adversarial proceeding, okay? Every single one of you that has a right to make a claim under this estate will have your opportunity to make that claim at the end of the case, okay? Every single one of you will have your day in court, or hire your own attorney if you want, but to argue for what you think is your proper share of the estate. So right now, you're all together. You're all working as one. We want to get the best possible settlement for the estate that we can get, and that settlement will come in a lump sum. In terms of how much each one of you will get individually, it doesn't matter who the conservator is. All that matters is in the very end that you've stated your claim, and that a judge will decide what approximate share is for you to get. It's fairly carved in stone what that is, but the judge will inform you of it, and you'll have your day in court to argue for your chance. So you don't have to worry that by your father or your mother being appointed conservator that you're going to get cut out somehow. It doesn't work that way. All they have is the legal right to sign the documents. That's it. So once I explain that to them, they will usually calm down. They'll usually feel better about it, and they'll realize that this is not the time to fight. Maybe the time to fight will be at the end of the case, but not now. So that would be one thing right there that you mentioned to talk about
Yeah.
early on in the case.
Yeah, family dynamics, and they haven't been through it before. They don't know. Are there anything like, assuming that everything is going smoothly, right? You've had the conservator conversation at the church, and everybody's like, okay, I get it. This is not an adversarial situation. I'm going to get my day in court. Are there other things that happen during the course of a case that people are just surprised, like, oh my God, I didn't know that that was going to be part of this kind of a thing? Are there typical or things that you see in your practice that come up that surprise people?
I've had cases where relatives or family members were distrusting of the entire procedure, maybe because that's has to do with their distrust or lack of friendship with their other family members before this ever happened, and so they'll hire their own attorney. And now all that means is that that one claimant now has his own private attorney. It doesn't change the case, and he can file an appearance with the probate court saying, "Hey, I'm representing claimant, you know, Billy, the third son. I'm representing him and
Hmm.
him alone." So that becomes part of the file, and he can argue for that for Billy's share at the end of the case. But it doesn't change the case. So sometimes something like that will pop up, and when which case they have the legal right to do it, and I say, "Hey, welcome aboard." You know,
Yeah.
in reality, all that claimant is getting is giving up a portion of their money to that lawyer. You know, in addition to what the
Right, right.
primary lawyer is getting anyway. So it's not helping them financially, but if it puts them at ease, then so be it. So
Yeah, in the end, it's that's not in your control, I suppose. Um, we've got about a minute left, and I'm just curious, Mark, given your decades of experience, what tends to have the biggest impact on how a wrongful death case ultimately resolves? Are there one or two things that usually are the biggest factors?
well, I start with like any carpenter would with the basics, the foundation. Is the liability been proven?
Hmm.
If the liability
Hmm.
has been proven, that's the one big issue out of the way. Then the other issue we're talking about is the value of the damages. If it's a wrongful
Got
death,
it.
there's no disputing because, there's nothing more serious than wrongful death. You can argue, was there suffering that the person had to do before they died? That has its own compensatory value. Another aspect could be the effect on the family of that wrongful death,
Hmm.
financially. Maybe before the accident, they were on one track, living in certain kinds of homes, going to certain kinds of schools, and now all of a sudden their life has dramatically changed financially, where they can live, where their
Yeah.
kids can go to school, being raised without a father. Those are the more emotional aspects of the case. And when I tried a wrongful death case, many years ago, I brought the kids up onto the witness stand. I brought in the case I had, a child died, and I brought both parents up on the witness stand, and I had them tell stories about their child. Okay, stories not the kind that would, maybe make sense to a scientist, but the kind that would tug at your heart. You know, and I always felt as an attorney that if I'm trying a wrongful death case, it's not enough for me to just prove mathematically or intellectually what happened in the case. I want to tug on the heartstring to the jurors, okay? And I'm going to find, and by getting to know the family, by just sitting down, shutting up and letting them talk, they will tell you so much, about the dynamics of their family, what made them laugh, what made them cry, what made them the most proud. And revisit those before a jury because juries are human beings. And I know that when I did my summation in that particular case, I saw tears in their eyes. And I had some in my own. I was choking up a bit as I was giving my summation because it was that true to me and it was that true to them. And if you can make them not just hear your case, but feel your case, then you've done a big service for your client and ultimately a big service for your ultimate judgment as well. So
Oh, that's great. That's great. Well, listen, Mark, good to see you. Good to talk to you. Thanks for sharing. We're out of time, but I know we'll talk again in the future.
thank you, Sean. Appreciate it. You have a wonderful day.
You too. That's it for today's episode of Detroit Auto Accident Law with Ravid and Associates. Thanks for tuning in. If you want to learn more or schedule a free consultation, visit the website ravidandassociates.com. You pay no legal fees unless they recover for you. I'm Sean O'Connor, and I want to thank you for listening. And don't forget to like, leave a review, maybe subscribe to the show so you don't miss the next episode. Have a great day.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.